Most everyone who listens to this broadcast agrees on the importance of literature in translation. We'll learn about other cultures, their writing styles, what drives them spiritually. Aside from English being the prime international language of choice, translating world literature into English is a way to immediately introduce great works to a much broader audience. My guest today is Professor John Ridland, who taught for over 40 years at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He's also known as a translator of Hungarian poetry and literature.
I remember being in the classroom in the EGYESULETE University. Yeah, and the windows looked out on the Danube. All right, but we need to get to János Vitas. We went out to dinner one night, and there were very few. This was 1987, so there were far fewer restaurants. So we walked down the street to the Erzsébet Hotel, Erzsébet, and we went down to the János Pince, right? The
famous János Pince.
It is famous, yeah. And we sat at a table. I was at the end of the table looking at one of these pictures on the wall, and it was the one where he is flying on the Griffin, flying home to his village, and you can see a little tiny spire of the church where he's going. And there were two verses underneath, and I was really baffled, and I said, what is this about? And then I noticed that all the other tables had a different part of the story, picture of the story. And they told me, well, it's this poem, folk epic sort of poem, and everybody knows it. And we didn't say much more, but I got the name down. And when I came back...
this was the Petofi Sandor.
Yeah, and this was the János Vitas.
Petofi Sandor János Vitas.
Yes. I learned that you say the, quote, last name first. And when I got back here, there was an English book of English translation of Petofi poems and some of his letters and things. And I read the story. It was in prose. And I read it and I thought, wow, this is a really remarkable story. It's not like anything in English. It starts out in the village.
What was different?
It was the combination of a village boy and girl love story, and then he gets in trouble and he's kicked out of the village, and he goes on he joins up with the hussars, and then they go on this peculiar itinerary from, where do they go? The Tartars first, and the Tartars are dog-headed,
yes.
Dog heads, and you begin to, at first it seems all very realistic, and then he joins the army guard and cavalry, and it's nice that these troops are not so heroic that they're going to fight against 1,000 dog-headed Tartars,
yes.
Because luckily the head of them had once been in Hungary, and people have been so nice to him that he thought the Hungarians were the most wonderful people, and he gave them a passport to go free. And they went from there. I think they go to India, and then they go climbing the mountains, and it gets hotter and hotter the closer they get to the sun, where they thought of this trick. When it got a bit colder, each dismounted and carried his horse on his shoulder to keep warm. And next to India is France. And they go into France, and the French king has been kicked out by the Turks, and they've taken his daughter, and then you get this exciting chase where they battle the Turks, and he goes chasing after the Turkish, he gets the French princess, and the Pasha's son is saying, have mercy, magnanimous knight, if nothing else moves you, consider my plight. I'm a young fellow still, life has so much to give. Take all my possessions, but allow me to live. And Jones says, you can keep your possessions, you cowardly knave. You're not worth my hand sending you into the grave. And take this word home if you're not too afraid. Let them know how the sons of marauders are paid. And so he goes off, saves the princess, and they go back to the king, and the king offers him, you can marry my daughter, and you can take the throne. I'm tired of being the king. Yes. And it's just so much fun as that's going on, and it's also now realistic, because after all, the French princess is most beautiful, yes, and he's attracted to her, but he says, that there's his girl Ilushka back, yes, in the village, and although they didn't say that they would be true to each other, there's no way that he cannot be true to her. And he explains how he had been discovered as a boy, and then how they'd met, and so after he tells the story, everybody's moved to tears, and the king says, well, of course I won't force you to marry my daughter, but I'll give you something in this sack of gold. And he sends him on his way to sail from France to Hungary, which is a little bit difficult, but although at that time Hungary would have had a seaport. Yes. But of course then there's the storm, and the ship goes down, and you never would think that this griffin, which I think in Hungarian it means a kind of large bird, right? Yes. And yet in English or other, it's a combination. It's a lion with an eagle's head, yes, and wings. It's a monstrous kind, yes, of bird that picks him up and takes him back to Hungary, and he can see. And this was what I first saw. This stanza about over how many countries she'd crossed, heaven knows, when suddenly, just as the bright sun arose, well, the very first ray of the glittering dawn straight onto John's village's steeple shone. And he's delighted that it's such a surprise.
Why do you think that this is something worth to spend months, years to translate it? Why is it a message to the world?
I think, yes.
Why it's important is really a, yes, quality that you just work on, yeah, this, because this is truly worth,
mm-hmm, and it
to be known by other nations and countries, yeah, and all around the, yeah, world.
In English.
In English, yes.
Well, I found a French translation in the library, which was very helpful because it could tell me line by line. Mm-hmm. It was in verse, where the English one was in prose, and I wouldn't have known how the lines matched up without the French. But then in his introduction, the French translator says, there is nothing in our literature like this poem. And I thought, well, it's the same in English. There's nothing that appeals. Yeah, yeah. It's just so unusual, and it's so it moves. It has such movement. When he comes back to the village, he's come flying in. This scene that I'd been looking at, and he comes in, and he walks through the village, and they're having harvest. They're getting, and nobody notices him. He gets to her house, and there's a young woman he doesn't recognize, and he says, "Well, where is Ilushka?" She doesn't recognize him.
Yes.
He's so weathered and, yes, sunburned and all, and he's older, of course. And that's an interesting thing, that time, the passage of time. He doesn't need to say, after 10, 15 years or something, he returns to the village. he uses the girl who says, the woman who says, I was the little girl next door that used to come running in and out, and now she's a young woman herself.
Isn't it amazing?
And then
just
you wrote
2-3 sentences,
yeah,
and then
and you've jumped like that.
that's the uniqueness of
Yeah. It's, I mean, that's very modern. That sort of. I mean, it's sort of like a movie almost. Where you
Yes.
go, a flashback to when she was a little girl here. Oh, you're and then she has to tell him that she's died under her cruel stepmother, which is
Yeah, so what Petofi thought, and then that time when he wrote this, then this is very much a message on the 21st century still.
This could happen today, except for all the magical things.
Yeah, exactly. This could happen these days.
And he's totally heartbroken. And apparently, that's where he ended the poem when he was first writing it. And he took it to Vörösmarty's circle. Vörösmarty, and they all said, "Oh, good, but you must go on. You must continue."
Encourage them to read it.
Yeah, that's true.
That's the purpose.
We
so
won't
we don't want to
them.
tell them
No,
the
we
entire
shouldn't,
story.
and we shouldn't tell them the
we shouldn't
ending. No.
we shouldn't tell them
But
the
it's
ending.
totally unexpected at the end.
It's a great story, and well, in Hungary, you know that all the elementary students have to learn, and they learn basically not just you know Petofi, but Radnoti, Kosztolányi, all the poems.
Yeah.
And that's part of the curriculum.
Yeah.
The elementary school curriculum.
And it involves memorizing and reciting.
Yes,
right?
it involves
and that used to be, even when I
reciting.
went to school here, it wasn't. We just had 3 little passages of Shakespeare we had
in
to
the United
memorize.
States, yeah.
But in the previous generation, they had done that in the U.S.
Now it's barely.
Now I don't think they read poetry, because in the English departments of universities they don't read poetry, or at least they don't read it as poetry. But then there's also a lot of creative writing courses and students who want to write poetry, and they may be keeping it alive.
But the foundation is important. And
yes, that's true.
Well, let's talk about a bit, just like Márai, Radnoti, Kosztolányi.
Yes.
You did all the
Yes.
translation.
And
why
how did we
you stayed with
get to those?
again the Hungarian?
Well,
and specifically on this book, Márai book, why do you feel that the world needs to know about this?
Well, now for one thing,
Márai?
he was one of those who was exiled. He went out of the country, and he lived in Italy, and then he lived in San Diego the last years of his life. And so that he's an example of what's happened in the millions of refugees from all over the country, and how, and he made the point himself, Márai, being, for a writer, a poet, to be uprooted from his language, that when in Hungary he's hearing Hungarian spoken all the time, and he comes to San Diego, and there are a few Hungarians, and they will come and have a talk, and then that's it. But he was also this man of principle. He wouldn't ever go back as long as there was a single Soviet soldier in Hungary. And the ironic thing was, 6 months after he died was when the Russians left.
Yes. He was homesick all the time.
Yeah.
He suffered,
Yes,
greatly.
yes. There's a passage in Shakespeare that says, "How can I live without my language? Taking my speech away from me, because I can't talk to anybody." And so Márai wrote, and he wrote more fiction, more prose than poetry, but he thought of himself as a poet.
So this book, The Withering World, by Sandor Márai.
And it's Alma Classics, the publisher.
This is still available.
It should be. Yeah.
It is bilingual, so it's in Hungarian, one page Hungarian, and the next page is in English.
Yeah. He wrote these wonderful, the Book of Verses, Verses König, 1945, where you get details of, it was like in Budapest with the Nazis, and then
Would you read
the
just a little part?
The light askance that blazed up in your eyes, the fog that cloaked my eyes and kept them shut, the glove through which your pulse would dip and rise, the lust that tied my body in a knot, the minute that escaped us with shrill cries, the life without you that is still a life, the hand that switches off the electric light, the word that fails to call you back and dies.
It's beautiful.
And here's where they're in the city with the destruction all around. He says, humans once walked here. Trees recorded this. Observe the landscape. Hereabouts lived men. The dead lie yellow. Yellow the flames hiss. This rock cliff gave its life for one of them. The earth trembles, trampled by human feet. The trees no longer look up from the street. Hyenas yip, red foxes whimper too. All shivers, human smells are blowing through. And then the next stanza, watch out, a human being. Dive below the dense thicket for the wild woods to sustain. The lion will conceal you in his mane. The hyena will not harm you, lying low. Bed down beside the viper, tiger, ferret. Play possum. The good puma will not dare devour you. What you feel, the sedge will share it. Whimper, whine, hide. Watch out. A man goes there.
It's beautiful.
That's good. That's good. And
But I would like to... Just a little bit of Radnoti. And
Radnoti is the one I like the most. And I thought this cover that was very expressive. And you know, his widow, Fanny, died only maybe 10 years ago, when she was over 100 years old, and she was still sharp. And she looked at our translations, and she said ours were the best translations of the eclogues, where the poems that absolutely blow the minds of Americans. Let me just read the postcards, because the forced march is longer. From Bulgaria, the gruff, savage cannon fire booms, thudding to the mountain ridge, then wavers and dims. They all pile up, humans, animals, wagons, thoughts. The road brays and bucks, the mane of the sky bolts. You are within me, constant, in this moving pandemonium, always motionless. In my mind's deepest cranny, you shine mutely as an angel amazed at the ruin, or a beetle set to bury itself in punkwood. Punkwood is that soft, when wood has gone rotten and soft. Then the second Lasklenitsa was 9 kilometers from here. They're burning the hayricks and the houses. And squatting dumbly along the meadow's fringes, shell-shocked peasants smoke their pipes. Here, stepping into the water, the shepherd girl ripples the still pond. And leaning over that pond, her curly-haired flock are drinking up clouds. The third one is only 4 lines. The bullocks' maws are dribbling bloody spittle. All of us to a man pass blood in our piss. Our stinking company halts in savage bunches. Over us blows death's repulsive stench. Hello, greetings from California. I'm John Ridland. I have had the privilege to translate some of the great poets of Hungary, beginning with Petofi, Sandor, Musorunk, Sandor, and Radnoti, Miklos. And those have all been published in books. And I've also done Kostelani leisure poems. I know that you are you are reciting poems. You are speaking poems out loud to let people know about them. And I just want to encourage you to go on doing that. The world needs poetry. It needs poetry from all the languages it can reach. MAGYAR, VERSMONDOK, EGYESULETE. Good luck and goodbye.